Hi, I'm Professor Steve Gedeon, and welcome to Entrepreneurial Career and Life Design Tool number 9, Goal Setting and Hypothesis Testing. You might think it's a bit strange to be talking about goal setting because goals tend to be so central to the planning-based mentality. But you also need goals on the search side of things as well, too. We just call them hypothesis tests. You need something to head towards, you need a direction to go in when you're hunting, but you need to be flexible and to sometimes pivot and move into different directions. But you still need goals on both sides. Goals really are the linchpin between your beliefs and attitudes and your actions. That just because you value something, you don't necessarily take action to achieve that value unless you form goals. And we know that goals work. Goals tie your actions to your values and beliefs, but they're also the means by which you change your habits or take charge of your reprogramming of your subconscious. This really is how you exert agency in your life, that if you're going to make sure that your actions are driven by your beliefs and your attitudes and your values, goals are the linchpin to hold these two things together. And we know that goal setting works. In the workbook, I give you some examples of some of the big thought leadership by Edwin Locke and Gary Lantham, who have really studied goal setting over a 35-year time period. Goals work. The single biggest predictor of performance, motivation, and satisfaction are goals. This is true both on the organizational side of things for company performance, but also in your individual life. They also know and they also show that the bigger the goals, the more specific the goals are, and the greater the level of buy-in, the greater their performance as well too. We know that higher goals give you higher performance. Low goals, low performance. No goals, pretty weak performance. Interestingly, telling people to just do their best doesn't work at all. That telling people to do their best results in worse performance than no goals at all. So, what kind of goals should you set? Well, I guess the question is, how much success do you want in your life? How much happiness do you want in your life? Do you want a lot of happiness, or do you want just a little bit of happiness? Do you want some misery to go along with your happiness, or do you want to be as happy as you possibly can? This is why we talk about having big, hairy, audacious goals, BHAG goals. Average goals and average effort will produce an average life. Do you want an average life, or do you want an odyssey journey? Do you want to be the hero of your own life story like we talked about last week? Let's talk a little bit about BHAG goals, big, hairy, audacious goals. I'm a sailor, and when you're in the middle of Lake Ontario, every direction looks the same. It's very flat. It doesn't matter which direction you look, it's flat. You want to go to Rochester? Flat. You want to go to Kingston? Flat. You want to go to Toronto? You got this big, hairy, audacious CN Tower. You can see the CN Tower from almost anywhere on the lake. From 25 miles away, you can see the CN Tower, and you know exactly how to get to Toronto. In fact, even if you don't want to go to Toronto, your eyes are naturally drawn to this big thing, and you're kind of sort of naturally steer towards the CN Tower. So it's important to have these big, hairy, audacious goals because you can see them very clearly. And even as you start to get closer, you can use this big, hairy, audacious goal to differentiate from the other buildings. So as you get closer to Toronto, being able to see the CN Tower gives you more definition to know, I've got to go around the island. So regardless of whether you need to tack, if the wind is in your face or not, having this goal really orients you and gives you direction for where you're going in your search, at least until you decide to pivot to a different goal. So when you're on the search side of things, goal setting really is replaced by hypothesis testing. And you want to take steps towards the achievement of your hypothesis goals. You want to test whether your goals are possible in reality or not. And then you want to learn and pivot as required, or maybe tack away to some alternative goal. We also know that what gets measured gets done. And so if you want to be happy, you should measure your happiness, and you should measure your attainment of these positive values in your life to make sure that you're achieving them. And again, we know higher goals gives you higher performance, so set big, high goals. This is why in the Odyssey journey, we wanted to make sure that we had a plan C or a version C that gives you some ideation around what might the most amazing life look like. You want to be the hero of your own life story, and so set some big goals and find out whether they're possible or not. So how do we go about doing that? So the first thing you do is you start with your wheel of life and you write down your goals, or maybe you've already written down a lot of goals and actions and to-do lists and obligations and things in the wheel of life tool earlier on. But you then want to rank your goals on whether they're long-term and abstract or whether they're short-term, specific, and something you can put onto your to-do list, something you can get into your calendar. So if they are specific, you want to find out whether they're SMART: specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and timely. If they're not SMART, they're a little too vague, then you might need to go through a mind mapping exercise or some other kind of an exercise to give you a range of more specific goals. So if it's too abstract, go through some mind mapping exercises and then generate a portfolio of more specific goals. Then you want to test these against the SMART framework. For each of your goals, you want to say, is it specific? Is it measurable? Is it action-oriented, realistic, and timely? And so it's okay if it's just S and M and R or something like that, but you really want to then also drive that down to be more and more specific until you can put it on your to-do list. This is why the A, being action-oriented, is so important. You have to be able to act and do something in order to get it onto your day timer. So once you've got your set of SMART goals or your to-do list of things, put it onto a 2x2 matrix of importance versus level of urgency, so that if something is not urgent and it's not important, you probably should try to find a way to just not do it. Try to eliminate these so-called quadrant 4 activities. That if it's not important and it's not urgent, maybe you can just ignore it and it'll go away on its own. Some goals or action items are in quadrant 3. These are things that seem to be urgent, but they're not important. Things like emails or phone calls or text messages or the phone rings and something like that. And here, the thing that you want to do is change your habits around this. So an example is, I rarely answer my phone because it might seem like it's urgent, but it's probably not. And it's probably not particularly important. Leave a message. I'll check it later on in the day when I batch process all my phone calls or emails. I check my emails first thing in the morning, but then I ignore them all day long and I check them again at the end of the day. And so you don't want to be distracted by these things that seem urgent, but they're not really very important. And again, you can change your habits around this. Now, if something's important and urgent, well, that's quadrant 1. You got to do that. That's got to get into your calendar and you got to do it right away. However, all of your most important but non-urgent goals, so-called quadrant 2 goals, these are the things, this is where all of your really important long-term goals lie. That these quadrant 2 activities include things like exercise or calling your parents, reading, doing your studying, things like that. That you might not have to study until the night before the exam, but you'd be far better off, and you'll remember it better, if you get this onto your to-do list sooner. Your parents will still love you if you don't call them this week, but eventually you got to do it. You'll still be, especially if you're young, you'll still be okay if you don't exercise every day, but you got to get this exercise in, even though it's not urgent. It's important, but it's not urgent. Relationship building is an important quadrant 2 activity. Take the time to focus on your relationships. Your friends will still like you if you don't call them for a few days or a week or 2 or 3, but if you ignore them for months at a time and then suddenly want something, maybe they're not going to be your friends anymore. You have to take time to build these long-term relationships. Got to get them onto your agenda. Working towards any long-term goal requires a bunch of short-term steps. And it could be a big report that's due, that you can't do your big report in one day before it's due. You got to break it up into smaller goals, get that onto your to-do list earlier on, and be working on it over a longer period of time. The life design interviews you're working on for this course are something you can't really defer until the last moment. You got to get that onto your to-do list earlier. Journaling, personal growth, habit formation, all of these are activities you want to get into your calendar and make sure that you're doing before they become urgent. Otherwise, they just never happen, and years go by and you've never formed better habits. You've never really done the journaling that you wanted to do. You haven't grown the way that you wanted to grow. The story I like is the idea of sharpening your axe. That there was a man out cutting trees, and the first day he cuts down 20 trees, and the next day 15 trees, and then 10, and then 5. And after a few weeks of this, eventually he's only cutting down half a tree a day. And eventually somebody comes by and says, you know, if you sharpened your axe, you could cut down more trees. You'd be more productive. You'd be more efficient. You should stop cutting down trees and sharpen the axe. And of course the man cutting down trees said, what are you, crazy? I don't have time to sharpen the axe. I'm too busy cutting down trees. The idea being, take the time to build your productivity, to enhance your efficiency by doing these quadrant 2 activities. A great example from my life was when I was CEO of a company, and every other Friday I had to write a bunch of checks to pay the employees for their pay period. And it took about 3 hours every second Friday, and I knew that if I devoted 10 hours, I could outsource that activity to an accounting firm that would do that all for me. So when do you do the 10 hours of quadrant 2 activity so that you no longer have to do the 3 hours every 2 weeks? Well, it might take you a couple of months before you get around to saying, okay, enough already. I got to buckle down and do my quadrant 2 activity. So when do you want to do your quadrant 2 activities? The idea is you got to get them into your life before everything else takes over. The story I like is you've got a glass, and you're trying to put as many things as you can in this glass. You put a bunch of big rocks into this glass. Is the glass full? No, of course not. You can put some smaller stones around those rocks. Is it full? No, you can put some sand around that. Is it full? No, you can pour some water or maybe some beer over the top. The idea is the small stuff you can fit in around the big things, but you got to get the big rocks in first. If you start by filling your glass with sand and small stones, you never have space for the big rocks. So the quadrant 2 activities are your big rocks. You got to get them in first. When do you get them in? The idea is get them in during your peak productivity time of day. Don't wait until the end of the day. Don't wait until you've spent 4 hours answering emails and checking Facebook and working on all the low-value things. Get these big quadrant 2 activities in sooner during your peak productivity. For me, my peak productivity time of day is between 10 and 1, and again between around 4 and 7 p.m. First thing in the morning, I'm kind of useless. I need to drink my coffee. It's a good time to check email and kind of plan out my day. By 10 a.m. though, I'm behind my computer, I'm in my office, and I'm working on what my big quadrant 2 activity is. Might be doing research, might be working on a book, might be making a video for my class, but I take the time to get these big activities in first. Around 1 o'clock, I'm tired, it's time for lunch. After that, I'm kind of useless. Good time for a meeting, maybe a Skype call or a Zoom meeting or two. Good time to do some of those low-value things like answering emails. But then by 4:30, I'm back behind the computer again working on my quadrant 2 activities. So you want to do these when you're at your best. I want to give you an example of a big, hairy, audacious goal that I had in my own life. I wanted to buy a boat, and I eventually achieved my life dream. This is my boat here. This is a 40-foot Beneteau First 405, sleeps 7 people, has 2 heads on board, a galley, hot and cold running water, color TV, a barbecue, and it's great for racing. But when I first set this hypothesis goal back when I was in my 20s, it wasn't particularly realistic. It was very vague. It was very abstract. I didn't have this kind of money. I didn't know, was I going to marry a woman that would want to be able to sail? How much money would something like this cost? Would I like sailing enough? Would it make me sick? So I had to break this big goal down into a bunch of smaller goals. And so following this process, it was too vague. I had to do some mind mapping to break this big goal down into a bunch of smaller goals until I eventually had some specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and timely goals, like join a yacht club, like learn how to sail. If you're going to have a big boat like this, you have to know how to fix the engine on your own. Take a boat maintenance class. Crew for other people. Become part of a regular racing crew and find out, do you like racing? Maybe take some racing classes, things like that. So I had to find the time to break this big goal into a bunch of little goals. But then I also had to take my wife out sailing and find out, does she like to sail? Would she be upset if I spent that kind of money? Were there other things that I needed to spend that money on instead? There were many opportunities to potentially pivot away from that goal. But it set kind of this CN tower that helped guide me towards saying, well, if I'm going to buy a big yacht someday, maybe I should work hard and finish my PhD. Well, if I'm going to be able to afford that big yacht someday, maybe I should save money. Well, if I'm going to afford a yacht someday, maybe I should take that job with the Army, even though I kind of didn't really want to, and it was a lot of extra work while I was also working on my PhD, but it got me on my career path a little faster. Well, I guess I'll do it, even though it was a lot of work and there were other, maybe more fun alternatives in the short term. So having this big, hairy, audacious goal kind of provided some direction in my life. And sometimes I would pivot away from it, but I always kept coming back to it until eventually I got the boat of my dreams. Goals require change. That goals are essentially a planned break from the status quo. That you're trying to deviate from your autopilot. That if your life is on a certain trajectory, goals are a plan to break with that trajectory. So if you're happy with your weight, you don't need a plan or a goal to lose weight. You're happy with your weight, you don't have to change anything. If you're making plenty of money, maybe you don't need any financial plans. But if you're concerned about how much money you've got, maybe you need some planning around finances. Or if you're concerned about your health, then maybe you need some planning and some goals around weight loss or eating more healthy or exercise or something like that. Change is hard. Change can be painful. Sometimes you fail. Sometimes you fall off. Sometimes you try to change your habits and they just don't work out. Or you set a goal, but it exceeds your reach and it's disappointing. Well, change sometimes requires unhappiness with the current status quo in order to give you the energy to devote to work on these goals. And this is where having positive values provides a motivating force. As we showed earlier, that you want this value, this big thing, this big, hairy, audacious value that directs your actions towards. In my case, it was like this boat. In your case, it might be some other big dream that you want to be able to achieve. But trying to avoid something like a snake doesn't give you a direction. It just says, run away from the snake. So set big goals. The reason why so many people fail to achieve their goals is they never really set them in the first place. So in other words, by failing to plan or by failing to start the search, they plan to fail. Your mind is like the homing system on a torpedo. If you don't set something for your torpedo to go towards, it just wanders around and eventually self-destructs. You want to set a goal or a target or some kind of a direction, even if you change that later on in the search side of things. To reach any significant goal, you have to leave your comfort zone. And you want to make sure your goals are SMART goals: specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and timely. Now, I've seen some people say that A stands for attainable, but attainable is kind of sort of the same thing as realistic. And the important thing is you want to make sure that your goal results in something on your to-do list. So it has to be actionable. So I know I've seen people talk about SMART goals and they don't use the word action-oriented. I think I'm right. I think that this is the right approach, that you want to make sure your goal is something that you can do. That if your goal is, be rich, well, yeah, but what do I do to become rich? Or, my goal is to have a boat. Well, yeah, but what do I need to do? What are the actions I need to take in order to get that boat? Or I want to lose weight. Yeah, that's attainable. It's realistic. It's measurable. But it's not action-oriented. What are the actions I need to take in order to achieve that goal? So that's why I think that action orientation is one of the most important aspects of the SMART goals. So, remember, entrepreneurship is like learning how to play the guitar. Crank it up to 11. Set big, hairy, audacious goals in your life. And if you decide that they're not working out for you, you can always pivot or tack away to something else.